I have an equal sort of idea as to how my role could benefit everybody in the future. It's not...
I, William, Prince of Wales, pledge my loyalty to you, and faith and truth I will bear unto you, as your liege man of life.
The moment William was confirmed as king, three things happened inside the palace before the public announcement was even made. A list of names was reviewed, a set of decisions was signed off, and at least one family connected to the crown was told, in no uncertain terms, that everything they had assumed about their place in the new royal order was wrong. Camilla's family did not see it coming, neither did half the palace staff. But William had been planning this day for longer than anyone realized, and what he did in those first hours changed everything. The morning everything changed. There is a moment in every seismic shift when the world splits cleanly into before and after. For the British monarchy, that moment arrived with a quiet announcement that carried the weight of centuries. Charles was gone, William was king, and before the flags had been lowered, before the crowds had gathered at the palace gates, before the television anchors had finished composing their expressions into something suitably grave, decisions were already being made inside those walls that would reshape everything. The transition itself had been expected. For months, the signs had been impossible to ignore for anyone paying close attention. Insiders had been quietly noting Charles's increasing frailty and his growing difficulty keeping pace with even a reduced schedule of royal duties. Internal discussions about succession timing had reportedly shifted from hypothetical to urgent, with sources inside the institution pointing to certain public appearances as potential final moments before a handover became unavoidable. The institution had been bracing itself. Senior staff had been quietly preparing, and William himself had been preparing for longer than most people outside his inner circle truly understood. But knowing something is coming and actually experiencing it are two entirely different things. Even the people inside Buckingham Palace, who had spent months anticipating this transition, described the atmosphere on that first morning as something they were not fully ready for. There was a quality to the silence in those early hours that former palace insiders say is unlike anything else. The silence of an institution holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of King William intended to be. They did not have to wait long. Within the first hours of his reign, William moved, not slowly, not cautiously, not in the measured, careful way that characterized so much of his father's approach to delicate situations. He moved with the decisiveness of a man who had been rehearsing this moment in his mind for years and had arrived at it knowing exactly what he intended to do. The people around him in those early hours described someone who was focused, deliberate, and entirely clear about his priorities from the very first moment. The first signals came through the people he chose to have around him in those initial hours. In any new reign, the question of who gets access to the monarch in the earliest moments is deeply revealing. Access in the palace is not just logistical, it is political. It is a statement about who matters, whose influence the new king recognizes, and whose counsel he values above all others. And the people who found themselves inside William's immediate circle on that first morning sent a message that was received very clearly by everyone paying close attention. Notably absent from that inner circle were certain figures who had become fixtures during the Charles years. People who had grown accustomed to their proximity to power and had perhaps begun to assume that proximity was permanent, found themselves quite suddenly on the outside of conversations they had previously been invited into without question. No dramatic confrontations, no public announcements, just the quiet, devastating experience of realizing that the new order looked very different from what they had imagined it would look like. And then there were the decisions. Not all of them were made public immediately. Some were communicated through channels that rarely surface in news reports, but the people who received certain communications on that first day understood immediately what they were being told. One decision in particular, involving the future role and residential arrangements of a very specific family connected to the crown through Camilla, landed with the force of something that had clearly been long considered and finally, deliberately executed. To understand that decision fully, you need to understand the position Camilla's family had come to occupy during the Charles years. Because the Bowles family had not simply been passive observers of Camilla's extraordinary journey from the controversial figure to queen. They had become, over time, part of the fabric of royal adjacent life in ways that carried real social weight and genuine access to real power. and they had, according to sources familiar with those dynamics, developed certain assumptions about the permanence of that position. When William became king, Camilla's constitutional position changed immediately and completely. As Queen Dowager, she would hold no formal authority, no official role, and no automatic claim to the residence and arrangements she had enjoyed as queen. Her future would depend entirely on decisions made by the new king. That reality, stark and unambiguous on paper, had perhaps not fully landed with everyone in the Bowles family orbit until the moment William's reign began and certain things became immediately and undeniably clear. What those who observed William's first hours as king consistently describe is a man who had no intention of allowing the habits, arrangements, and informal power structures of his father's reign to carry over unchanged into his own. He was starting fresh, on his terms, with his priorities front and center. And the signals embedded in his earliest decisions made that unmistakably clear to everyone paying attention inside those walls. The question being whispered in palace corridors by the end of that first extraordinary day was not whether William intended to reshape the institution around him. That much was already obvious. The question was how far he intended to go, and whether the people most affected by that reshaping had any real idea what was actually coming for them. Camilla's family receives the news. There is a particular kind of shock that comes not from something unexpected, but from something you knew was possible, yet never truly believed would happen. That is the shock that settled over the Bowles family in the hours following William's accession. They had known, in the abstract intellectual way, that people know uncomfortable things they prefer not to dwell on, that the transition would change things. What they had not fully reckoned with was how completely, how swiftly, and how deliberately it would change things for them specifically. The Bowles family had spent years building a quiet but significant presence in the orbit of the crown. Camilla's journey from the most vilified woman in Britain to queen had been one of the most remarkable rehabilitations in modern royal history, and along the way, the people closest to her had benefited from that journey in ways both visible and invisible. Her son, Tom Parker Bowles, and her daughter, Laura Lopes, had carved out lives that existed comfortably in the warm glow of their mother's elevated position. Invitations arrived, doors opened. A certain social gravity attached itself to being the children of the Queen. Tom Parker Bowles, in particular, had become a recognizable figure in his own right. A food writer and author of genuine talent, he had nonetheless moved through a world where his mother's position added a luster that went beyond his professional achievements alone. He was present at significant royal occasions. He was photographed alongside figures of enormous social and cultural weight. He occupied a space that few people outside the immediate royal family could claim, a space defined by intimacy with the institution, without the formal obligations that came with being inside it. Laura Lopes had built her life similarly, present but not intrusive, connected but careful about how that connection was displayed publicly. Both of Camilla's children had, by all accounts, handled the extraordinary circumstances of their mother's position with a degree of grace that earned them genuine respect from observers on both sides of the royal debate. But grace and careful conduct, however admirable, do not change constitutional realities. And the constitutional reality that arrived with William's accession was brutal in its clarity. Here is what happened in those early hours. Communications were sent. Not hostile communications, not cruel ones. The British establishment does not traffic in cruelty when quiet efficiency will serve the same purpose far more effectively. But the substance of what was communicated to those in Camilla's immediate circle left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. The arrangements, the access, the informal understandings that had governed their relationship with the palace during the Charles years were under immediate review. Nothing was being confirmed as continuing. Everything was subject to the preferences and decisions of the new king. For the Bowles family, the experience of receiving that message is described by sources familiar with the situation as deeply disorienting, not because they were unprepared for change in the abstract, but because the speed and the tone of it communicated something that went beyond the merely logistical. It communicated intention. It communicated that William had thought carefully about this transition and had arrived at conclusions that did not place Camilla's family anywhere near the center of his vision for what the new reign would look like. And then there was the question of Camilla herself. Because whatever the Bowles family was processing in those early hours, Camilla was processing something considerably larger. The woman who had fought for decades for acceptance, who had endured public hatred on a scale that would have broken most people, who had finally arrived at a position of genuine dignity and institutional belonging, was now navigating a transition that stripped away the formal architecture of everything she had built. No constitutional role, no official position, a title that would shift from queen to queen dowager, a designation so rarely used in modern times that most people in Britain would struggle to explain what it actually meant. Sources who have spoken to people close to Camilla describe her in those first hours as outwardly composed, but internally grappling with the full weight of what the transition meant. She had known this day would come. She had spoken about it with Charles in ways that were careful and forward-looking. But knowing and experiencing, as we have already established in this story, are two entirely different things. And experiencing it on the actual day, surrounded by the reality of a palace already reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity, was something no amount of preparation could fully soften. What made it harder was the specific nature of William's earliest signals, because it was not simply that things were changing. Change was expected and accepted. It was that certain of those changes carried an emotional charge that went beyond the merely administrative. Decisions about which residences would be made available. Decisions about which staff arrangements would continue. Decisions about the degree to which Camilla would be included in or gently distanced from the visible life of the new reign. Each of those decisions, communicated through the careful, indirect language that the palace uses when it wants to send a message without leaving a record, told a story that the Bowles family heard with painful clarity. The question that nobody in Camilla's circle was willing to ask out loud, but that everyone was privately asking, was a simple and devastating one. Had William been waiting for this? Had the tolerance and the surface civility that had characterized his relationship with his stepmother masked something that was now, with the power finally in his hands, beginning to show its true shape? Those who know William well are careful about how they answer that question, but none of them deny that the answer is complicated. And complicated, in the language of the British establishment, is very rarely good news for the people on the receiving end of it. The decisions that shocked the institution. Power reveals itself in decisions, not in speeches, not in ceremonies, not in the carefully managed public appearances that constitute the visible surface of royal life, in decisions. And on his first day as king, William made enough of them to leave absolutely nobody inside the palace in any doubt about the kind of reign they were entering. The institution had braced for change. What it had not fully braced for was the scale, the speed, and the surgical precision with which that change arrived. The staffing decisions. In any institution, and the monarchy is an institution above all else, the question of who serves whom and in what capacity is never merely administrative. It is a map of power. It shows you who the person at the top trusts, who they consider aligned with their vision, and who they have quietly decided belongs to a chapter that is now closed. William's earliest staffing decisions drew that map with a clarity that left veteran palace observers genuinely startled. Several senior figures who had occupied positions of significant influence during the Charles years found themselves, within hours of the transition, receiving communications that made their new and considerably diminished status unmistakably clear. These were not people on the fringes of the operation. These were individuals who had been central to how the palace functioned on a daily basis. People who had built careers around their proximity to the previous king, and had perhaps assumed, not unreasonably given their track records, that their expertise and institutional knowledge would make them indispensable to whoever followed. William did not see it that way, and the speed with which he moved to reshape the senior layer of palace operations told its own story about how long he had been thinking about this, and how certain he was about what he wanted. Sources inside the institution describe a king who arrived at his position with a list, not a literal list perhaps, but a mental architecture of exactly who belonged in his reign and who represented the habits and compromises of a previous era that he had no intention of carrying forward. The residential decisions were equally significant and in some ways more personally charged. The question of who lives where in the constellation of royal residences is never simply a matter of square footage and convenience. It is a statement about standing, about belonging, and about the degree to which the new sovereign considers certain individuals part of the living fabric of the institution going forward. William's decisions on this front landed with particular force on those who had grown comfortable with arrangements established during his father's reign. Clarence House, which had served as Charles and Camilla's primary London residence, became an immediate subject of quiet but intense discussion in those first hours. The question of whether Camilla would remain there, move to different accommodation, or find herself subject to entirely new arrangements was one that palace insiders say was resolved with a speed that surprised even those who thought they understood William's intentions. The answer that emerged, communicated through the careful indirect channels the palace favors for sensitive matters, was not what Camilla's circle had hoped to hear. Beyond the personal and residential, there were structural decisions that signaled something even larger about the direction of William's reign, changes to how certain offices within the palace would operate, adjustments to which external organizations and causes would receive the formal backing and association of the crown going forward, a thorough and apparently pre-planned review of the portfolio of patronages and associations that had accumulated during the Charles years, and would now be evaluated against William's own priorities and values. Those priorities, according to people who have spent time understanding how William thinks, are meaningfully different from his father's in ways that go beyond mere personal preference. Charles had been a king shaped by a lifetime of waiting, a man whose interests, passions, and intellectual commitments had developed over decades of preparation, and who arrived at the throne with an agenda that reflected all of that accumulated thought. William is a different generation entirely. His instincts about what the monarchy should be, what it should prioritize, and how it should present itself to a world that has changed enormously even in the past decade, are shaped by a different set of experiences and a different sense of what the institution needs to survive and remain relevant. One area where that difference expressed itself immediately and unmistakably was in the question of modernization. William had made no secret during his years as Prince of Wales of his belief that the monarchy needed to shed certain inherited habits and present itself in ways that felt genuinely connected to contemporary British life, rather than simply performing a version of tradition that increasingly few people outside a specific demographic felt any personal connection to. On day one of his reign, certain decisions were made that reflected that belief in concrete and institutional terms. Among William's earliest decisions was one that directly affected the degree to which Camilla's family would have any ongoing formal or informal relationship with the palace operation going forward. It was not a cruel decision in its presentation. It was delivered through the language of institutional reorganization and forward planning, but its meaning was received by the Bowles family with complete and painful clarity. The message embedded in that decision was one that the British establishment has delivered many times throughout its history, always quietly, always through structure rather than confrontation, always in a way that leaves the recipients with no official grievance to articulate, but an absolute understanding of where they now stand. You were part of the last chapter. This chapter belongs to someone else, and that someone else has already decided exactly what it is going to look like. Kate's role in all of this. If William is the force that reshaped the palace on day one, Catherine is the architecture behind that force. That distinction matters enormously, because the coverage of this transition has largely focused on William, on his decisions, his signals, his vision for the new reign. What that coverage has consistently underestimated is the degree to which Catherine, now Queen, has been not just a supportive presence beside him, but an active and deeply influential force shaping the thinking behind every significant move he has made. This is not a story about a woman standing behind her husband and whispering instructions. Catherine is far more sophisticated than that framing suggests, and the people who know her well find that particular narrative both reductive and inaccurate. What she has built over the years of her marriage, through careful observation, through genuine intellectual engagement with the questions facing the monarchy, and through a quality of emotional intelligence that even her critics are forced to acknowledge, is something considerably more powerful than mere influence. She has become, in the truest sense, an equal architect of the reign that William always knew was coming. The signs of this were visible long before the transition happened. In the months when Charles's health was making the question of succession feel increasingly immediate, it was Catherine who was being quietly positioned for a larger role with a speed and deliberateness that caught the attention of royal observers. Reports had emerged that Charles himself had been moving to fast-track Catherine's formal elevation, recognizing in her a steadiness and a public authority that the institution would need at its center during a period of transition. Those reports, dismissed by some at the time as speculation, look considerably more significant now that the transition has actually arrived. On the first day of William's reign, Catherine's presence was felt in ways that were both visible and invisible. Visibly, she stepped into the role of queen, with a composure that palace staff describe as remarkable, given the emotional weight of the circumstances. There was no period of adjustment, no visible hesitation, no sense of someone still finding their footing in an unfamiliar role. She arrived at her new position as though she had been inhabiting it in her mind for years, which, by all accounts, she had. The invisible dimension of her influence on that first day is harder to document, but impossible to ignore if you speak to people who were inside the palace operation during those early hours. Certain decisions that William made, particularly those involving tone and presentation, and the careful calibration of how the transition was communicated, both internally and publicly, bear the unmistakable mark of someone who thinks deeply about perception and consequence. People who know both William and Catherine well will tell you that William is instinctively decisive, but that Catherine is instinctively precise. And precision, in the delicate business of managing a monarchy in transition, is worth more than almost any other quality. What are Catherine's priorities in this new chapter? That question is one that people close to her have been asked repeatedly since the transition, and the answers, while carefully worded, paint a consistent picture. Children and young people remain at the absolute center of her public agenda. Her work in that space during the Wales years was not simply a portfolio assignment. It was, and continues to be, a genuine personal commitment rooted in convictions she has held and developed over many years. That work will now carry the full weight of the sovereign's household behind it, and sources say Catherine intends to use that weight with considerably more ambition than she was able to deploy as Princess of Wales. But beyond the public agenda, there is a domestic and institutional priority that sources describe as equally central to how Catherine is approaching her new role. She is, by all accounts, deeply committed to creating around William and their children a version of royal life that feels genuinely stable, genuinely warm, and genuinely insulated from the kind of institutional dysfunction that has created so much damage in previous generations. That commitment is not merely personal. It has institutional implications that are already reshaping how the palace operates on a daily basis. Specifically, sources describe Catherine as having strong and clearly communicated views about who has access to William, about how decisions are made and by whom, and about the culture of the household she is now responsible for shaping. Those views align closely with William's own instincts, but they add a layer of consistency and follow-through that people who have worked with both of them describe as genuinely new in the palace environment, where previous royal households were sometimes characterized by competing factions, unclear lines of authority, and the kind of informal power structures that created endless internal politics. The early signals from the new reign suggest a household that is being run with a clarity of purpose that the institution has not seen in some time. Catherine's influence on the shape of the new reign is not limited to the internal and the domestic. It extends, according to sources, to the question of which relationships and associations from the previous chapter of royal life will be welcomed into the new one, and which will quietly find themselves on the outside. And on that question, Catherine's instincts and William's decisions appear to be in complete and deliberate alignment. The Bowles family situation, the Camilla question, the Sussex dimension, all of these threads run through a central needle that is Catherine's vision of what this reign should be and who belongs inside it. She has not spoken publicly about any of these matters. She will not. That is not how she operates, and it is not how William's palace will communicate on sensitive subjects. But actions communicate what words carefully avoid. And the actions of the new reign's first day have communicated with extraordinary clarity exactly where the boundaries of belonging now sit. The people on the wrong side of those boundaries already know it, and the people on the right side of them are only beginning to understand how different everything is about to become. The Sussex question on day one. Every new reign carries unfinished business from the one before it. Debts that need settling, relationships that need redefining, wounds that have been managed rather than healed and that now, under new circumstances, demand a decision about what happens next. For William's reign, the most visible and most loaded piece of unfinished business arrived on his very first day, wearing a name that the entire world already knew: the Sussex question. Harry and Meghan. The fracture that had defined so much of the public conversation about the royal family for the better part of a decade. What would the new king do with it? The answer that emerged from that first day was not delivered through any public statement. William made no announcement about Harry, no press release, no carefully worded expression of familial warmth designed to signal an openness to reconciliation. Nothing that could be quoted or clipped or turned into a headline about brotherly love surviving against the odds. What happened instead was something considerably more revealing. What happened was a very particular and very deliberate silence. And in the language of the palace, silence is never the absence of communication. It is communication in its purest and most unambiguous form. In the hours following the confirmation of William's accession, the question of whether Harry would be contacted, how quickly, and in what form, was one that people on both sides of the Atlantic were watching with intense interest. Royal protocol in moments of transition carries certain expectations, certain courtesies, certain gestures of continuity that signal, whatever the private realities might be, that the institution is larger than its internal conflicts and that family, however complicated, remains family. Those expectations existed. The question was whether William would honor them. Sources familiar with the communications that did and did not take place on that first day describe a situation that is considerably more nuanced than either the reconciliation narrative or the total estrangement narrative that the media tends to reach for. There was contact, but the nature of that contact, its tone, its content, and crucially what it did not include, told a story that people close to Harry received with a mixture of emotions that sources describe as quietly devastating. What was not included in that contact was any invitation, any gesture toward inclusion in the formal rituals of the new reign, any signal that the door which had been functionally closed for years was now opening even slightly. The communication that reached Harry was described by those familiar with its contents as correct, proper, appropriately formal given the circumstances, and utterly devoid of the personal warmth that would have been required to suggest that anything fundamental had changed in how William viewed the situation his brother had created. For Harry, receiving that communication in California, thousands of miles from the country where his family's history was being remade without him, the experience is described by people close to him as profoundly isolating. He had known, intellectually, that William becoming king would not automatically resolve anything. He had known that the transition would not erase the years of public conflict, the interviews, the book, the accumulated weight of everything that had been said and done, and could not be unsaid or undone. He had known all of that, and yet, there is a difference between knowing something and feeling it arrive with the cold finality of a formal communication that treats you like a distant acquaintance rather than a brother. Meghan's reaction is described by sources close to the couple as a complex mixture of anger and something that looks, from the outside, like vindication. She had always maintained, in private if not consistently in public, that the institution would never genuinely change in its fundamental orientation toward them, regardless of who sat on the throne. The events of William's first day, as they filtered through to Montecito, appeared to be confirming that position in ways that made further argument about it unnecessary. But here is where the story introduces the complication that makes the Sussex dimension genuinely fascinating rather than simply sad. Because Harry's response to William's silence was not, according to sources, simple anger or simple hurt. It was something more ambivalent and more revealing than that. People close to Harry describe someone who is simultaneously wounded by the distance and quietly, uncomfortably aware that the distance is in significant part a consequence of decisions he made and cannot unmake. That awareness does not make the pain of the situation any smaller, but it adds a layer of complexity to his position that the simple narrative of wronged exile versus cold institution does not fully capture. There are people in Harry's life who have been encouraging him, for some time now, to consider what a genuine approach to repair might look like. Not a public gesture, not an interview or a statement designed to shift perception. A private, quiet, genuine reaching out to his brother that acknowledges the damage without demanding anything in return. Whether Harry has the capacity to do that and whether William would receive it if he did, are questions that nobody close to either of them is willing to answer with any confidence. What William's first day made clear is that the initiative, if it ever comes, will have to come from Harry. William is not going to open that door from his side. He has a reign to build, a vision to execute, and a very clear sense of what belongs inside that vision and what does not. And as things currently stand, a Harry and Meghan-shaped complication does not appear anywhere on the map of the reign William has spent years designing. Whether that changes is the question that will quietly follow this new reign for as long as both brothers are alive. And the answer, when it finally comes, will tell us more about both of them than anything that has come before. What this reign will look like and why nothing will ever be the same. Every monarch leaves a mark on the institution they inherit. Some marks are subtle, accumulating slowly over years of quiet decisions and gradual shifts in emphasis. Others are immediate, structural, and impossible to miss from the very first day. William's mark, based on everything his first day revealed, is going to be the second kind. And the people inside the palace who have spent careers navigating the careful rhythms of royal life are already adjusting to a reality that feels fundamentally different from anything they have known before. The generational shift that William's accession represents goes deeper than age or style, or the surface differences between one sovereign and the next. It represents a genuinely different philosophy about what the monarchy is for, who it serves, and how it should present itself to a world that has changed beyond recognition since the assumptions underlying many of its traditions were first established. William has watched, with clear eyes and considerable frustration at times, as the institution struggled to remain relevant to people who felt no instinctive connection to its rituals or its hierarchies. He has thought carefully about what relevance actually requires, and his conclusions are going to reshape things in ways that will surprise people who assumed the monarchy was essentially unchangeable at its core. The one thing William is said to be absolutely and unmovably determined to do differently from his father is to draw clear and unambiguous lines around who belongs inside the working fabric of the institution and who does not. Charles, by temperament and by genuine feeling, found those lines difficult to draw and even more difficult to maintain. His instinct toward inclusion, toward reconciliation, toward keeping doors open even when keeping them open created complications, was a defining characteristic of his reign and a source of both its warmth and its vulnerability. William does not share that instinct. The lines he is drawing are clean, they are deliberate, and they are not going to move. What that means in practical terms for the families and figures who find themselves outside those lines is something that is already becoming visible. The Bowles family is navigating a new reality that bears very little resemblance to what they knew during the Charles years. The Sussex situation is settling into a distance that feels, for the first time, genuinely permanent rather than temporary. And the broader extended circle of royal-adjacent figures, who had grown comfortable with their proximity to the crown, are discovering that proximity under William operates on entirely different terms than it did under his father. William is not picking up where Charles left off. He is starting something new, on his terms, with his people, according to his vision. And the institution that wakes up each morning under his reign is going to look less and less like the one that existed the day before he became king. Nothing about what comes next will be familiar to those expecting the monarchy to simply carry on as it always has. William will make sure of that. And that is where William's story begins. A king who arrived with a plan, a vision, and absolutely no intention of waiting. Camilla's family rattled, the Sussexes sidelined, the palace already reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. This reign has only just started, and it is already rewriting the rules. There are developments coming in the weeks ahead that will make everything you just heard look like the opening chapter.